thank you, and thank you for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. And I'll get this microphone closer to me. We actually updated the version of the film, and if you would like to go to the actual Vimeo site, what we added at the end was something that probably Lisa is going to speak about in a little bit, and that's how changes in the law in Oregon could actually be made so that what has happened to Lisa, and unfortunately what has happened to many other women, do not happen anymore. But what I'm going to speak about just briefly, just a couple minutes, because really this is not my story, but this is exactly the point that I want to make. I'm a journalist and a filmmaker, and I approached Lisa and Louise after Karen James, who is right here, host and producer of Prison Pipeline cable radio show, told me about their story. And I was working at the time for a class project as I was getting my master's in multimedia journalism. Our class decided to work on gun-related issues, and for me, gun issues are more than just you for them or you against them. And what I wanted to show is that unfortunately, because some people just have a different experience in life, and sometimes they choose weapons not so much because they're for them or against them, but for their own safety and for saving their own life and that of their children. But really, what I wanted to do, and as you saw at the end, this film was made in collaboration with Lisa and with Louise, because for me, I want to push for a different way of doing journalism. And I didn't want the film to be my interpretation of Lisa's story. I want it to be Lisa's story. And some people, journalists out there, would tell you that as a journalist you need to be objective, and as a journalist, you need to come without biases. I don't know how many of you out here can be objective and non-biased. I know I can't, whether I'm in my journalist skin or not. By the way, I am who I am every time. So being a journalist is part of my identity. But really, I want to push for a different way of doing journalism, and what I wanted to do was acknowledge Lisa as an expert of her own story, and me just as an expert of how do you operate a camera and edit a story together. And I have never experienced domestic violence, and especially not Lisa's story and what she has experienced. And so I really wanted it, I wanted that film to be what she wanted it to be, but not just, a way to tell what has happened to her, because it is horrific, but also a video that could bring change, that we could use as educational tools being here today, but also to encourage legislative changes. And so, I just would say in conclusion for my part is that experience of collaborating with both Louise, an expert working with women in Lisa's case for 30 years, and Lisa having experienced the story, has been such an empowering and lifting moment for me. Not only have I learned a lot about myself, about me as a woman, and about being a journalist, but I have also made new friends, lifelong friends. And so we've been, showing this film several places, and every time I also come out because, again, I am really pushing for a different way to do journalism in a way that actually is also activism. So don't want to blow your mind so much. I know maybe not many of you are journalists, but I think that there is a way, and if you are being approached by a journalist that asks to tell your story, make sure that this is according to your own needs, not that journalist's needs.
And it's giving me the great honor of introducing Lisa Swart, who is without a doubt my hero in many ways. So Lisa, it's your turn.
Can you hear me?
opportunity to be here because one of the things that happens to women in prison is that we lose our voice immediately. And we're not allowed to speak. I was not allowed to speak to the press at all. And so other people spoke and they didn't speak the truth and they didn't have my story. So I appreciate it. And when I do get the chance to tell what really happened in my case, it's amazing the understanding that happens and the willingness that people come about with wanting to change the circumstance. I don't know how many of you realize that Oregon has the worst record on violence against women in the lower 48 states. So I spent 12 years thinking about ways we could change this. And I came up with some ideas. And it's what would have been at the end of the film for a domestic abuse shield law. And I would really like to get a comprehensive law passed. Because what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. And I have a little story. When I was first in prison out in Pendleton, there was a guard or an officer who was staring at me all the time. And finally it made me uncomfortable enough that I confronted her. And I said, what's up? And she was really embarrassed. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. My boyfriend keeps threatening to kill me. And I look at you all the time and think, I could end up like you. And, we stopped being inmate and guard, which was against the rules, whatever. We were women. And I said, well, do you believe him? Is it an empty threat, or are you afraid? She goes, I'm afraid. And I said, well, in Oregon, you have two choices. It's handcuffs or a headstone. And I chose handcuffs, but my children are alive, and I get to see them sometimes. It's not the choice I would want to make. So that was in February, and then we moved to Coffee Creek in April, and in June he killed her. So that was Officer Melendrez. She had a name. She had a face. Sorry. Anyway, we shouldn't only have those two choices. So, I'm really happy to be working with Voices Set Free because we do groundbreaking work working with not just victims, but their children and also the batterers. Because if you, as John pointed out, have empathy for people, they can change. And that's one of the biggest tenets that I want for this domestic abuse shield law is mandatory batterer intervention classes anytime there's an abuse or a domestic call made, even if there's not an arrest. Because if you can create education and understanding early on, you're going to prevent a lot of the stuff that happens later. And then I'd like to take a moment to mention what other states are doing that's better than what we're doing in Oregon, and, because these are things that we can implement. And in Kentucky and Washington, Minnesota, and Illinois, for example, they say that on every domestic violence call, they have to do an actual investigation, which means interviewing the children and the neighbors to establish a pattern. Because what happens a lot in Oregon, if a man chokes a woman, you don't see those marks for a day or two sometimes. But if you're getting strangled in your fingernails, the man gets scratches, so the woman gets arrested. And that happens way too much. In those states, it specifically is on the books saying you don't arrest someone for a defensive wound that they inflict. Another thing that they do is they have a definition of what constitutes domestic abuse. And it's causing physical harm, sexual harm, and also fear of serious injury or sexual harm. And every person in the state of Oregon needs to be on the same page on this. There seems to be tremendous confusion in this area. For example, in my case, I had 4 years of documented abuse. An ER doctor had pressed charges against my husband at one point, and the reason that she knew that my injuries were inflicted by abuse, despite the fact that I lied and said that they were from a skiing accident, was because she herself was a victim of abuse, and she was a doctor and her husband was a doctor. So she knew what she was seeing. And I told the police when they came to the hospital that I was afraid of him because he had threatened to kill me And that in other states would have been considered terroristic threatening and been 5 to 20 years in prison. Then he threatened to kill me if I testified against him. And this is in the reports, but nobody did anything. Well, the DA in that case forgot to mention to me when the trial was, and I never found out about it. I didn't even know when it was. And later it was dismissed. And that's a violation of the Violence Against Women Act, which brings me to the next point, that that we need to have a mandatory enforcement committee for the Violence Against Women Act, because in the state of Oregon, nobody is enforcing it. And I was at a similar symposium like this with Hardy Myers, who was the Attorney General at the time of my case, and I said, you know, to paraphrase it, dude, who should I have gone to? You know, what should I have done? And he admitted to me, there's nobody enforcing it, maybe you should sue civilly to try and hold them accountable. And it's like, are you kidding me? If there's no enforcement, the law may as well not exist. And you know, he had the decency to apologize to me, but that doesn't give me 12 years of my life back, my children's lives. I'm still on parole. I lost everything financially. It doesn't get that back, and it doesn't help the women who every day are facing the same issue. In the state of Oregon, women and children die at a rate of, on the average, 1 per week. It doesn't happen once a week, but that's the average. And we shouldn't have to just consider ourselves expendable. So I think everybody needs to understand what constitutes abuse. The DA in my case said, oh, just choking her a little bit and those 17 injuries, that's not really abuse. And, you know, there was this guy when I was in jail, he was 6'7", and he was, you know, big guy, and I thought, now, if he did exactly to that DA what my husband did to me, I wonder how, if the DA survived, I wonder how long it would take for him to figure out it was abuse. The judges and the DAs and the police in this state do not have a consensus. There are a couple of really good judges, which I found out today, yay, but not all of them are like that.
No pressure.
This is on you now.
I'm not going to disagree.
Seriously, because I'm not just speaking for myself. There are so many women back at Coffee Creek, and I promise them when I get out, I'm going to tell people your stories because nobody can hear you from in here. And one of them, you know, got arrested. Her boyfriend was choking her, and she picked up a knife. He got a day in jail because strangulation isn't even a felony under most circumstances. She got 3 years because she picked up a weapon. You know, another woman came to court with bruises, and the judge gave custody of her 4 children to the husband because clearly she couldn't take care of them in her condition. I mean, these are the types of things that we need across the board consensus on. So, and the definition of imminent when it comes to self-defense. Other states have done a much better job on this. And it means impending danger. And in those states, it can be inferred from a past pattern of abuse. And if there's a fear of injury that will occur in the future. And what the state of Washington Supreme Court found was that the case must be looked at from the view of a reasonable woman who has been battered, not a reasonable man who has not been battered. And that's what's happening, you know? And the case they used, I love this because I'm almost 5'4", and my husband was 6'2", and they say the impression created that a 5'4" woman must, under the law, somehow repel a 6'2" intoxicated man without employing weapons, basically deprives her of her constitutional right to self-defense, and that law is unconstitutional. Well, that's what Measure 11 does to us, and Measure 11 is consistently being applied in a gender-biased way because it is being applied to women who have to use weapons to defend themselves. So one of the components of the Abuse Shield Law I want is a caveat so that Measure 11 is not applied in domestic abuse situations, and also no DA could file charges unless they have a grand jury approve it, and the grand jury has to be a DV-informed panel. Because what happens in rural counties in particular, you get a DA doing an information and just charging people, and once somebody is charged I mean, once you're in the system, it's crazy, you're in the system. And I know I should have put this on, but this is how much money the state uses to prosecute people, and this is how much money they get to defend themselves.
Oh.
So it's basically, you get 5% when a public defender yourself against the charges that they spend. And speaking of money, as we've heard, it costs $31,000 a year to incarcerate a woman, 15 to 20 to keep her children in DHS. Minimum Measure 11 is 70 months. So basically, if a woman has one child and the charge of prosecuting her, which averages out to $108,000 for all Measure 11, if you just look at everything from assault to manslaughter. Anyway, one woman, one child on a 70-month, it's $466,000. That's one woman. If you get a murder charge, that goes up to $930,000. And if she has a child in DHS for, let's say, 17 years, with the prosecution costs and everything, that's $2.5 million for one woman who shouldn't have been charged in the first place. And that $2.5 million, to put things in perspective, the whole budget that they gave to the VPAC last year, the Violence Against Women Political Action Committee, was $4 million for the whole state. So we're talking charging one woman. It's insanity. So anyway, what we can do with a fraction of that for Voices Set Free is just help so many women. And that includes the children down the line who are traumatized. If their parents got help early on instead of later, they wouldn't go to prison. Okay, so it's time for me to wrap up. Check out our website for the rest of the components of this law and support an abuse shield law. Thank you.
Just so you know, our last speaker is not Kathy Bone. She had an amazing family emergency with her son's house burning down. But we love her. She also is a woman who fought back, who got a life sentence and is now free. She would have been here, but in her place is my newest staff member, who is on the other side, similar to Kathy, with wanting to tell you her story very briefly. Of course,
You want to grab the microphone?
Oh,
so.
yes.
Hi, so I'm really nervous. Yeah,
You'll be good.
Yes.
I know. So I just threw together some of the incidents that happened to me in my abusive relationship that really affected my life, and I'm already gonna cry.
We support you.
Yes. We're crying with you.
I cry all the time.
Sorry. I have a cold, and then this is my first speech time. First time I've talked about it. So my name's Crystal, and I'm a survivor of domestic violence. So I'm just going to read this. I was in a very abusive relationship for almost 3 years. We began a long-distance relationship after meeting online. We made the decision to move in together after only 8 months of dating. So I left everything I knew and moved to the East Coast to start a life with this man whom I thought loved me. He put his hands on me for the first time within a month of us living together. I was in total shock. The first incident consisted of him pulling me to the ground by my hair and screaming at me. That was my punishment for confronting him regarding other women he had been seeing behind my back. The abuse escalated. Within 3 months, I had endured my first severe beating, which resulted in many bruises up and down my body. I did go to the Danbury Police Department to report what had happened, but changed my mind before an officer had the chance to take my report. I left in a hurry, afraid that he might find out what I'd planned to do. He had already filled my head with threats and manipulation. During the next beating, I endured a black eye. I went back to the police department, only this time I followed through with a report and allowed them to take pictures. but I was still so afraid of him that I refused to give my name or his name to the police. I told the police what he did for a living, the area we lived in, and warned them that if something terrible happened to me, that it wouldn't be an accident. Sorry.
Okay, deep breath.
The abuse that left lasting scars wasn't that of the physical abuse, but that of the emotional. I'm sorry. He put me down, called me degrading names, made sure I knew I was worthless. He assured me that nobody else would ever love me. He controlled my every move, made it impossible for me to hold down a job, and cut me off from any interaction with the outside world, including my own circle of friends. I could have been one of those women sitting in prison. I too was faced with the decision to defend my own life at the cost of my husband's life. He was on top of me, strangling me with one hand while covering my mouth and nose with the other. He was beyond drunk and irate. His gun was lying out on the nightstand within arm's reach, but I knew if I chose to grab it, I had to follow through and shoot him. If I didn't, he would view me as too much of a threat and he would kill me for sure. I knew the odds were against me, that nobody would believe me. I knew I'd never see my children again. And if I chose to take his life, I never reached for the gun. Instead, I looked over. I'm sorry, bear with me with this computer. Instead, I looked over at our 5-month-old son as he watched his father attack me. I'm sorry. And with tears in my eyes, I stopped fighting, closed my eyes, and accepted that I was going to die. I don't know what made him stop. All I know is I did wake up with him sleeping right next to me, and somehow I survived. If I had defended myself that day, I would more than likely still be sitting in prison. I truly thought my life was in jeopardy that night. But the sad reality is that women who choose to live and fight back are ridiculed and re-abused by the justice system. I'm sorry. So you may wonder why I didn't just leave, why I didn't call the police. It's because my abuser was the police. He was an officer with the United States Secret Service and had served in the military. He had a spotless reputation and a good rapport with all local law enforcement. He had made it clear that no one would ever believe me if I reported what he had put me through. He told me if I ever left him and did remain quiet about the abuse, he would fight for custody of our 2 boys. Of course he'd win. He was Secret Service and I was nobody. And if I did choose to tell on him, and I made him lose his job, he'd find me and kill me and my children. I had nowhere to turn for help. I was going to have to save myself. I finally found the courage to leave on December 15th, 2010. My abuser tried to kill me. He killed me and thrown me up against a wall that morning. He had stated several times that he was going to end my life that day. When I heard him getting into the gun safe, I ran to the back door and swung it open so the neighbors could see in. I knew he wouldn't come near me nor cause a scene if he knew people could see. He wouldn't want to risk losing that job of his. He stood between the living room where our infant son was and the family room where I stood with the door open. I couldn't get to my son safely and was forced to make the decision to run for help without him. It was by far the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my life. to leave my infant child behind, not knowing what harm might be done to him. But I knew if I went back in the house, it wouldn't end well. So I ran, 6 months pregnant and barefoot in the snow, with nothing but pajama pants and a t-shirt. I ran until I saw a woman who was leaving for work, and I pleaded with her to allow me in her home. She let me in and woke her husband to tend to me while she dialed 911. But all I cared about was my child. The 911 operator kept asking me what had happened and told me to calm down, but I just kept crying and telling her that my baby was still in the house. Within minutes, it was all over. He was taken into custody that day, and a police officer brought me my son unharmed. We were rushed to the hospital and released later that evening. I'm sorry, my computer's tweaking out. I'm almost done. We moved back to Oregon to start over. I thought we were finally free from abuse, but I was wrong. He still had control over parts of my life. For the last 3 years, I fought an uphill battle. I went forward with a criminal trial against him, hired an attorney and filed for divorce and sole custody of my children, worked full-time and raised 2 little boys on my own with no support. I was worn out, but I kept going. The criminal trial took place over a year after the incident happened. It wasn't an easy year. I flew back and forth to New York many times for hearings, meetings, and scheduled trial dates that never went through. It was expensive and time-consuming, but most of all, it was heartbreaking and draining. A 6-person jury found him not guilty of almost all the charges, and guilty of only 2 violations. He walked out a free man, required only to pay a fine of $750. That's what my life was worth to the justice system. The courts did not allow me to present any evidence of the abuse I endured, even restricted what I could say regarding the abuse. I had my rights taken from me. I was not allowed to be present during opening statements, during anyone's testimony, including his, nor was I allowed in during closing arguments. He was allowed to be present for everything. My rights were taken from me, while his were protected. I refused to let that break me. I was awarded sole custody of my boys. I was able to persevere through a criminal trial where justice failed me. I rebuilt my life. I have my boys. I have a home. I now have a wonderful man in my life who never puts his hands on me, nor does he break me down with his words. He accepts my children as his own, and he is a positive male role model in their lives. I am now a domestic violence advocate with Voices Set Free. I volunteer at Monica's House with the DVRC, and I'm a speaker on the Washington County Domestic Violence Survivors Panel. While justice was not served in my case, I will continue to fight for justice for other survivors, victims' families, and the brave women who found the courage to defend themselves when no one else would.
Thank you. We wanted to deliver, and we did. More than we thought. It's a wonderful job that Voices Set Free does, and women in here, and the men who help us, and our allies. I just think this day is priceless in so many ways, and we will have a display table with some of our things. We're going to be able to have people pick these up. We're asking for a $5 donation of the film if you'd like to take it with you and share it. We have other things that we want to talk to so many of you about. I just want the lunch to be wonderful. I hope we don't have to spend all our time just trying to eat, but talk to each other as well. So with that, is there anything, we're almost on time. So we wanted to have questions, and of course, we ran out of that, but can we have a couple?
5 minutes.
Questions? Have you any questions?
I have a question or a comment about it. Oh, sorry.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, we've got time for both.
I was just wondering if you could speak to women who are in prison because their abusive partner killed one of their children and they weren't able to do anything enough rather to protect their child.
Lisa has a story about that.
I do. I have.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have a friend, in fact, who sought a restraining order from the judge in Deschutes County, which was and denied, and then her husband killed her child, and now she's doing 16 years on failure to protect. And she told me, obviously, I would rather be doing your time than my time because your children are still alive.
So it happens.
Yeah.
Judith? Yes?
There were some excellent recommendations for legislative changes. What are you working on those for the next session? And with what groups are you working on?
You. You're the best. No, we're definitely getting legislators interested. We have a small group of us though. We need more. When I hear that they have 600-700 volunteers, that's what we need in the outside world too, because the legislation is starting to, manifest. This afternoon you're going to hear about people who know how to make that legislation. In fact, they've helped write it for Washington State. Let's take some advantage of their being here and take action. I mean, our legislators are clueless, and not because they really want to be. Their job is to be, informed, but they don't know these stories. They don't have a sense of who we're talking about. It's a whole uphill thing. But yes, we want to do definitely legislative action. I mean, she's speaking, Lisa, our star, is speaking in front of the Rotary Club in 2 weeks, I think.
Yeah, February 11th at the Downtown Rotary.
Multnomah, 300 people. We're
Governor
building.
Hotel.
Pardon?
Governor Hotel.
That's right.
Third floor, Governor. Okay, well, it's exciting to see people opening to what we can bring to them and not walking away. So many people deny this is going on, and it's changing because we say the cost is too enormous, the emotional, physical. So, are there another question? Good.
I really connected with both of your stories. I'm a survivor of domestic violence. My mother is also. And one thing that you said that I really resonated with was when you go into, when you're in the violence, your voice is taken away, and when you go into prison, your voice again. And so I'm wondering what type of leadership programs or programs for women who are incarcerated would you like to see?
That's an interesting. Bring in Delphine with the camera. We tried, but they don't want us in there. The prison system is very shut down to this kind of media, and yet the one film we do have at our office is called Sin by Silence. It's about the California movement. That film alone changed the legislation of a bill, and it got signed by Governor Brown this January to try or bring out the mitigating circumstances. We could do that with her film, but we need to get people to help us do that. You're right though, we need a media onslaught. Okay, one more?
It's just me.
Yeah.
I also volunteer with Voices. But Lisa, you were incarcerated, so it's kind of, feeding off that. What would you see as possibly being effective for women who are both on the medium side and the minimum side in re-entering and having to develop relationships again?
Well, first of all, I think that women who have been through what I've been through should probably be redirected to a program more like how veterans who have PTSD go to an intensive 3-year program instead of 25 years in prison or 12 years in prison, because you lose your skills, you lose your connections. I am so far behind in my career that I don't, it's so overwhelming to even catch up. So I was not prepared in any way to meet the changed world, you know, in terms of a economic situation. And that's just, I mean, when you look at it, that's why I asked how many people were Measure 11. If there are, say, 600, and if a quarter of them even were directed towards a program like that, that'd be about $93 million a year. And, you know, you could do a lot more with that money to prepare people for reliving. I mean, just to be honest, I used to be a really good cook. It took me a whole year to kind of get those skills back. Forget about trying to use an iPhone and a computer and a digital camera. I was a professional. It's so overwhelming. I mean, sometimes I go to a store and I break down into tears.
I can say this without being sexist. I think we need more women in political office and in judgeships, because as receptive as men can be, they can never be as empathetic as a woman to see the kinds of problems at all levels here. So besides doing all this legislative work, try to get as many women as you can get all levels, and you'll further, that'll be just another way, I think, of bringing some help to this area.
Yes, thank you for saying that, and I would also want to encourage the 7 men in here. He counted them for me. If you are in a position where you can hire women, please do. Because women are applying for these jobs. Okay, last question.
As a comment, Laura,
Yes.
and the only way really we can prevent this kind of sexual violence and intimate partner abuse, right, is by educating them. I mean, when the vast majority of these crimes are happening, you know, by men, we need to be doing more educating around what does it really mean to be a man and not masculine.
Yes, thank you. And this issue of domestic violence is very often framed as this is a women's issue, and only 7 men in here. It is a men's issue. Women are victims and survivors. Men are perpetrators. Not all, and survivors as well. Thank you. But yes, let's broaden the conversation. Thank you so much. And as Louise said, we have a table out there, so come talk to us.
So lunch.